There we go. Okay. Thank you for joining us for today's event. This week, the Society of Illustrators, along with several of our friends, are hosting some great presentations. Even though MoCA Arts Fest was not able to happen this year, we felt it was important to highlight our comic and cartoon arts community. So we created this week of virtual events and received overwhelming responses. We are so happy to be sharing some wonderful creators with you. Thank you to everyone who is participating this week. I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Stanford Carpenter. Dr. Carpenter is a cultural anthropologist, artist, and chairman of the advisory board for the Black and Brown Comics Arts Festival. He is an experienced educator who uses anthropology to give lectures and teach courses on artistic production, comics, media studies, pop culture, visual arts, and identity in a variety of educational settings. He has authored numerous articles and cartoon-based projects that address research-related topics, including the introduction of Invisible Men, the trailblazing Black artists of comic books by comics historian Ken Quattro. And now Dr. Carpenter and the panelists will talk to you more about Megascope, a line of graphic novels dedicated to showcasing speculative and nonfiction works by and about people of color, with a focus on science fiction, fantasy, horror, history, and stories of magical realism, published by Abrams. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Hello. So we're gonna have a ton of really great people that we'll be speaking with. I'm gonna run down the list of people, and I'm gonna give you a little bit about them, and then we're gonna jump into a lively conversation. First, we have John Jennings.
Hello.
John Jennings. He's the founder and curator of Megascope. He is a professor of media and cultural studies at University of California at Riverside, and the illustrator of the New York Times bestselling Kindred graphic novel adaptation. He is also the adapter of the graphic novel After the Rain by Nnedi Okorafor, which we'll be going into more. We also have Jasmine Joyner. She's an assistant editor for Megascope and Shirley Books, and a freelance writer. Jasmine has finished their first zine of essays and short stories called The Cosmic Egg. We have David Brame. He's a comic creator who has worked on titles such as Box of Bones and Necromancer Bill. He is the illustrator of the graphic novel After the Rain. We have Eric Anthony Glover. He is an award-winning feature writer, television writer, and graphic novelist. As a writer for the arts and entertainment company Meow Wolf, Eric developed storylines and wrote scripts for immersive science fiction exhibits across the country. He is the writer of the graphic novel Black Star, which we'll be talking more about. We have Arielle Jovinales. She's a New York-based freelance illustrator, writer, and comics artist. Her work has been featured in the Eisner and Harvey-nominated anthology Fresh Romance, and in magazines, comic books, and branded social media campaigns. She is the illustrator of Black Star. We've got Alverne Bell. He has an MFA in fiction writing from Columbia College Chicago. He is a recipient of the 2014 and 2015 Glyph Comics Rising Star Award for his writing on One Nation, Old Druids. In 2009, he received the first ever Luminarts Graphic Novel Award. He is a writer of the graphic novel Across the Tracks. And last but not least, we have Stacey Robinson, assistant professor of graphic design at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. As part of the collaborative team Black Kirby with artist John Jennings, Robinson creates graphic novels, gallery exhibitions, lectures, and workshops that use strategies to imagine new worlds inspired by design, hip hop, the arts, and sciences, and diasporic African belief system. He is the illustrator of the graphic novel Across the Tracks. Well, we've got a really incredible array of books. We're gonna talk about Megascope, but we're also gonna talk specifically about three books that we just mentioned: After the Rain, Black Star, and Across the Tracks. But first, I just want to open the conversation with John Jennings, and I want us to talk a little bit about how did Megascope come to be. Tell us your story, John.
I will do so. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for attending. Super excited. I'm not going to waste too much time because these other people are far more important because they have these amazing stories about the books to tell. So it basically kind of started with the success of the Kindred graphic novel. Myself and my good friend, Dr. Damian Duffy, we did an adaptation of Octavia Butler's seminal work, Kindred, and did pretty well in the market. It's debuted at #1 on New York Times bestsellers list, won Eisner, Bram Stoker Award, that kind of thing. And so what started to happen was, there was some interest in doing some more adaptations, and we're actually working on, we did Parable of Soar, and now we're doing Parable of Talents, but I had a conversation with our publisher, Andrew Smith, and was telling him, like, there's other works out there that we could be looking at. Octavia Butler is astonishingly talented and visionary, but there's so many people who have been inspired by her that we can talk to and actually look at like original content. And so what happened was when he and Charlie Kochman gave me who is the founder of the Abrams ComicArts line, or imprint, excuse me, to basically submit some ideas for what could become a sub-imprint or a line of books under ComicArts. And so the term Megascope comes from this W.E.B. Du Bois short story called The Princess Steel. And in the book, in the short story, it's a device that can look through time and space and other realities. And I thought that it would be a great title for a line of books. And so I pitched it to Charlie and Andrew. It went up to flagpole, and it seemed like it was a great idea. And we started to look at speculative fiction from people of color, by and about people of color. We're also doing some crime fiction and some historical fiction, like Across the Tracks and other books we could talk about a little bit later. But that's kind of like the skinny of it. And we just launched with After the Rain in January, which is a short story adaptation by Nnedi Okorafor. The original story is called On the Road. Me and my friend David Brame did that. And yeah, we can talk more about that later, but I want other folk to have the floor to kind of talk about, their feelings about Megascope and things that they have actually created for the line. So,
well, and if Jasmine, if you could come on screen. Hello, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Really good, really good. Can you tell us a little bit about? I'd like to hear a little more about how you came into Megascope.
I came into Megascope while I was seeing John's work. We were like neighbors and collaborators, and I saw him working on the line, and I saw that they needed assistance because there were so many moving parts and not enough people to help get things rolling, I guess. So I just was recruited kind of by John to come on and help with the administrative and giving looks at pitches and manuscripts and art.
invaluable, by the way. Jasmine's brilliant. So,
Well, and also one thing I think is interesting, and I think that it'd be nice for people to have a better understanding is this is coming up, especially as Afrofuturism is becoming a really big deal. But the emphasis on Megascope is Black speculative fiction, and I was wondering you could talk a little bit about the move immediately towards Black speculative fiction as opposed to just going with some of the hotter categories in the moment.
well, I mean, so just to be clear too, it's not just. I mean, there are a lot of Afrocentric titles, on the list so far. Obviously, I'm African American, so I'm so I'm thinking about that particular space, in particular. But it is by and about people of color, so we are looking at a spectrum of speculation. I will say that there is a zeitgeist around Black speculative culture that has been, I think, on the rise for like a decade or so, and I think there are two watershed moments that kind of push things forward. Of course, one is Get Out, the movie by Jordan Peele, and also, of course, Marvel's Black Panther character. But I do think that there's been like a push, towards looking at this spectrum of experiences. Again, Afrofuturism as a term is a kind of like a catch-all for a lot of different ways that we look at Black speculative culture, but it's actually a very black speculative culture is always, it's hard to say. That's one thing, but it's more of an apt term for exactly what's going on, I think, globally, and so this idea of like speculation of Black spaces is something I think is at the core of it, whether it's like horror, science fiction, fantasy, or what have you. Afrofuturism and Black speculative culture together has become this space where we can actually have these conversations about the past, present, and future, reconciliation of these particular types of traumas, and also what it takes to actually let these particular things go and move forward. So, and Black folk have mostly used our creative endeavors to deal with these particular type of issues, whether it's the Black arts movement, Harlem Renaissance, what have you. Art and music and dance have always been ways to talk about these issues. And I think comics have always been part of the initial conversation, but I think now we're seeing that the comics medium is becoming a bigger player in that, in a sense, in those conversations on a global scale.
And so, I mean, I want to move over to After the Rain. Can we bring in David Brame?
Oh,
David, how are you?
Hey, yo, I am crushing it. I am having a great time.
So, After the Rain, I mean, John adapted it and you illustrated it, and John's been talking a lot. So I want to hear more from you about After the Rain. How would you say, what's the elevator pitch for After the Rain is?
The elevator pitch for After the Rain. It's a speculative fiction horror, creative, psychedelic romp about survivorship and Blackness as it pertains to Africa and Jujuism. That's your After the Rain 30-second pitch. your elevator pitch for that one.
Well, and tell me a little bit more about what it was like coming to this book. I mean, it's adapted from a short story by Nnedi Okorafor. I mean, so you got a lot of great writing behind it. But I mean, when I read it, my immediate description was it was a comic about it. It was almost like a comic description of a fever dream, right? Where there were moments where you couldn't tell what was going on because literally the lead character didn't know what was going on, right? And that's also the essence of horror, right? Is trying to figure out what is happening. So, I mean, I'd love to hear more about how you approach this, because I mean, the story itself was one where where there's not a lot to grab onto, and like you have to somehow give this form.
I think that was like part of what we wanted to create with this work was to sort of push the audience into that realm of sort of magic, of the suggestive, of what's in the shadows, what's in the darkness, what can't you see. So like a lot of the work, both with looking at sort of the meta narrative and looking at sort of just how the story unfolds. It's mostly about what the audience is experiencing really in their mind, and not so much about I guess the technical acumen of the creators, right? Mm-hmm. More about and eliciting that emotional response, that little part inside of your heart, the little bits that aren't corporeal, and activating those parts of creativity, So it's not just, I guess, our own creative, like what we're creating, but it's about the creativity in the mind of the audience, where we're sort of, in a way, forcing them to address what is in the shadows.
And one thing is and I mean, you did an amazing job. And one thing I think is really also interesting is how you categorize a book like this, right? You know, I mean, you know, Nnedi Okorafor's short story is, you know, it's very much, you know, she's very much about African futurism, African Jujuism, and but then the two of you are coming to that with your own sensibilities. You know, I also feel very much the ethnogothic in here as well, right? You know, I mean, I'd like to hear like what was it about this story that really captured you the most, that pulled at your emotions? First David and then John.
The setting really is what captivated me the most. In the making or leading up to After the Rain, I had spent you know 6 weeks sort of running around, traveling around northern and eastern Africa, and it wasn't necessarily in Nigeria, but it was just in the concept of traveling through both the Arab and African parts of Africa, and experiencing so many different parts of the continent, and sort of having that be part of what I wanted to bring, sort of an authenticity to you know the work. So like having had that experience and then bringing those sort of, I guess, that those kind of feelings and experiences to the work of what I read from Nnedi, and what John had presented me with from On the Road. I just that experience, that travel, that you know, the smells, the sights, the tastes, all of that. I wanted that experience to be encapsulated in this work of After the Rain. So even though it is about these horrific things that may be happening, like it more for me was about capturing this sort of the diaspora, capturing Igbo country, capturing you know, these more remote, and I guess you could say maybe more magically powerful places. So yeah.
I was gonna say for me, yeah, thank you. I was gonna say that for me, I've been friends with Nnedi for that's maybe like 12 years or so, and you know, when I first encountered her work, this was one of the first pieces I read, and you know, she doesn't do a lot of horror. This is actually probably the only like straight up horror story that she's written, you know, and it was just really, to me, it was like a prototype for how she's thinking about how she writes now, you know, because it's super early in her career where she's still dealing with the tensions of being like, you know, what she terms as Niger American, right? She's the daughter of Nigerian refugees from the Biafran War, but afterwards she got a chance to travel to Nigeria quite a bit, and so, you know, in her work she talks about this quite a bit, being of these two spaces, and living on this fault line between Nigeria and, you know, the suburbs of Chicago, right? And yeah, and I think that the mechanics of horror and the mechanics of dark fantasy and what she calls African Jujuism. Juju is the term for this kind of folk magic or spiritual relief practices out of that particular space in Nigeria. And so she's basically created like genres to kind of deal with how she thinks about speculative fiction, which is like African futurism and African Jujuism. And this particular story falls into the latter, right? And yeah, and so I think that she's really doing a great job of, like, you know, shouting out different aspects of how, you know, these speculative notions have always kind of infiltrated African literature. And I think it's a messy discourse, right? Where you come to face to face with different levels of trauma and also familial cultural practices and how you kind of fit into them. And so we were just trying to kind of like use the comics medium to talk about that. And so the panels, you know, represent the actual reality, and the gutter space, you know, kind of hovers behind. And so David and I were thinking about like how the background space kind of infiltrates the panels, and trying to kind of reify the comics, you know, as a true representation of what Nnedi was trying to get across.
David, I mean, do you have any other thoughts, David?
Yeah, like I think what we're trying to just sort of create overall with like the space of after the rain, and really capturing Nettie's just original work. I think just how we're able to, like I said, I guess it's not really adding more, or it's nothing new, but you know, the Jujuism and African folklore, and just sort of really building upon just this lexicon of Blackness and the way that we're telling new stories, and using, I would say, our own sense of creativity in the way that we decide how we're going to sort of break some of these long-held traditions and standards of storytelling. I think being able to connect with like sort of these different modalities of starting with a short story, and then having it adapted, and then using sort of, I guess you can say, sort of like a sampling style, you know, of, you know, just picking and choosing the different parts of our, what we love about creativity, and then putting it together to make something like After the Rain. Because you can, I guess we haven't really talked about it too deeply, but like, you know, we had all these, we had sort of a very loose way of building our story, and having that kind of I said looseness, that call and response, in the way that we built the narrative and the visuals. It was to me, that is all encapsulated, or it's all part of sort of our Blackness and who we are and what we're able to add creatively. So I think After the Rain sort of presents that as as a really solid piece of intellectual property, I guess.
And I mean, and it was a fun romp. I mean, what I want to do is I want to segue over to Black Star, because there's some interesting things that are that carry over, which is this idea of this movement, and it's trying to figure out kind of what's going on. So I'd like to bring in Eric and Arielle, and here we have the front cover for Black Star. That is so beautiful. Mm-hmm. You know, and I want to start off the same way that we did with the other one, which is Eric, can you give us the elevator pitch for Black Star?
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for hosting this. Thanks again for asking all these insightful questions. It's awesome to be able to talk to you, Dr. Carpenter. And for the elevator pitch, Black Star is about a helpless scientist who crash lands on a dangerous planet, and she's forced to race a pretty vengeful wilderness expert to a shuttle that's only built for one occupant. So this person, who's the main character, is named Harper North. She has spent no time accruing any of the skills she should have for surviving a hostile environment, but suddenly she finds herself in one. And at first she thinks she's the only survivor of this horrible crash that had 4 other people as crew on her ship. But she soon finds out that someone else has survived the crash, and they have very good reason to be upset with her. So it's a race to the finish. Whoever makes it to this auxiliary ship, which was never supposed to help people travel from a planet as distant as the one they're on, but will now have to be used for that purpose. Whoever makes it to that ship will be the only person who makes it back between the two of them. So lots of violence ensues.
and yes, it does. one of the things I thought was really amazing about this book was it had to do with the art and the aesthetic, and is that this is also a book that's very much about technology. But Arielle, as the artist, what you did was you took the technology and you really normalized it. I mean, I said this earlier in our little pre-panel discussion. It was like, it's like you took this amazing tech and put it in such a way where it was no different than me walking down to my kitchen and pushing a button on a toaster, right? It wasn't, you weren't featuring the tech, but not featuring the tech was actually much more interesting. Could you tell me a little bit about how you approached that? What were some of the challenges that you saw?
Yeah, sure. So I do want to say that Eric, it was inherent to Eric's script. But I think something that I did look for when I was reading the script version was how could this be adapted to a very visual medium like comics. And so in Eric's script, he had a lot of typing, a lot of scenes where she was just sort of like looking at the tablet on her wrist. And I just wanted to figure out various ways to make that look both visually interesting and also ways that the use of that tech, I could establish a visual language for it that could then elevate certain points of the plot with how that tech then would look on a page. So I think the result did wind up being pretty seamless in that I was just sort of always thinking about how the tech would relate to the story, how it would look on an aesthetic level, and how it was also sort of elevating the mood or the mood, like how would small text on a screen read versus like a large looming screen? How would that like translate emotion to a reader? That was more my brain when I was laying this out.
Well, and there's a good example of it actually on the screen, right on the screen share right now, right, where you see her dropping that little piece of her outfit into the water, and you see it's actually a defibrillator, and you very quickly start to see, but I love how visually it's like you see this picture of, or of almost like a graph of a human with a heart, and it's like, oh, we're gonna fix the heart, but you kind of know when she drops it in the water that she's got some other plan for it that doesn't seem very healthy.
That's a way to put it.
And it was really interesting. And it also speaks to the overall tone of this. It's like if After the Rain is this sort of African Jujuist ethnogothic sort of fever dream, right? It's like, I feel like in this, we're in this Afrofuturistic adventure. I mean, I feel like I actually feel like I've been dropped into a movie, and I love how it starts where you literally dropped onto a planet, and you don't really know everything that's going on. You're figuring out as you go away, and that type of pacing for this story was just, I think it really brought out. I like how you cryptically say, we find out that this other person has good reason to not like her. Again, I thought that was really good. I'd like to hear more about what you were thinking of when you were going into creating this.
Yeah, sure. The seeds of it were planted a while back. I've told plenty of people at this point that I usually write from anger. That's like where all of my creative juices start flowing. And I got really pissed one time when a friend of mine was discussing one of the 1,000 wars we've been in. Oh my gosh. I think we were talking about Afghanistan. And she just said it wasn't worth all of the American lives, And that qualifier really struck me. Of course, it's not worth American lives. But if she had said lives, I think I would have empathized a lot more with her point. But she, at the time, hadn't seemed to give any thought to thousands more casualties who were dying as a result of us being overseas. And that's, I think, what Harper North, the protagonist, is all about. She isn't quite able to understand, at least at the beginning, that some lives do not matter more than others. She's kind of this white collar worker. She's a very respected scientist, responsible for lots of breakthroughs. She might be able to create another breakthrough if she gets home. And the person that's chasing her and trying to get to this other this ship on time is a blue collar person, much more working with her physical body, not elite in any sense. And North assumes that because she has the higher paying job and ostensibly the more important purpose on this mission, that she deserves to go home more. And whether she learns to unlearn that at the end, I'll leave to all of you to read and find out. But going into this script, it was just very important for me to express my anger about any sentiment that anyone is disposable, that anyone can be regarded as lesser than just because they get paid differently, they look differently, and I think my anger may come through towards the end. We'll see what you guys think when you read it.
What did you think, Arielle? Did his anger come through at the end?
Oh gosh, even when I first read the script, I was like, yo, dude, whoa. But it's such like a wild ride, and I can't wait for people that, like, we're talking about it very cryptically right now, but I can't wait for people to read it. But yeah, I definitely feel there are a lot of, I think something that is really awesome about this script and what drew me to it is the sort of the complexity of the characters, and how I know that it sucks to say, but I feel like that's very, it kind of becomes, it's a little rare to see a script like that for female characters and also women of color characters. So to just sort of get to play in this world and have it just sort of be like, of course it is about women of color, but I think while I was drawing it, it just was so the norm that it just felt very cool to feel like I'm just here to, like, I'm doing my thing. I'm making like a speculative story, and it's like a good story genuinely. I'm not sure if I'm being totally rambling over here, but I don't know, it's just like a very good story, and it's women of color, and that's always sort of what I look for in the scripts that I do.
And that's actually part of what's interesting to me, is that the protagonists are two women of color, but we're not seeing them kind of framed in the narrative that we're used to seeing. When you have multiple women of color, usually it's about them working together, right? As opposed to using them to elucidate class, persisting into the future, right? I mean, if we're really going to talk about Afrofuturism, what's really interesting is once you start talking about people of color, women of color, Black women having a future, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't bring with them some of the same conflicts, right? I still, it's hard to talk about without getting into spoiler territory. But I love this story for especially to have two women of color as protagonists.
Thank you. Appreciate this.
Because I feel like we've seen this. I feel like we whenever we see a story that's remotely similar, it tends to not have that focus.
Yeah, I feel really privileged to be part of the Megascope line. And Arielle, thank you for the kind words about the story being good. That you have been critical to why the story is better than it ever would have been without you. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's Eric. It's just been like a good team, I think. Let's just leave it at that.
Well, we're not going to completely leave it. We're going to go. I'd like to move on to the next book, Across the Tracks. But at Q&A, I really want to bring you guys back because I mean, I want to hear. I know that the people who are watching want to hear more, and I want to hear more.
Will do. Thank you, Dr. Carpenter.
Thank you.
So with Across the Tracks, we have is written by Alverne Ball and it's illustrated by Stacey Robinson. Gosh, I'm gonna ask Alverne. Ooh, is he here yet?
I'm here.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm pretty
Okay,
good. How
I'm
are you?
gonna ask. I'm gonna hit you with the same question I hit everyone else with. Could you start by giving us your elevator pitch for this book?
Sure. So Across the Tracks is a historical, I guess a nonfiction historical true story about Greenwood, who basically created what we now know as Black Wall Street. It is a look at their everyday lives and the accomplishments of what they went through in Jim Crow South to build this extraordinary piece of American history. And that's the gist of that story.
All right, and Stacey, could you give us a little bit about how you came to this book?
I came to this book because John, I believe now John will have to correct me if I'm wrong. John talked about this book, and I think originally he had another artist in mind. And as I usually like to do with John, I was like, "Ooh, that sounds like something I would draw." And I was like, and then if John, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to lie on history, but I think then he asked me if I would be interested in doing it. And I was like, heck yeah, this is definitely in line with my research, right? So my work deals with what I would call Black utopian spaces, or Black spaces where Black people had agency, right? So this was right in line with my research, and I felt like this was my book. You know?
Well, it is now.
Right.
Right. Sure.
So I treated it like Nick Fury told War Machine about taking Iron Man's suit, right? He's like, "What you just took it?" Right? Yeah, Iron Man took the suit. That's what I did with Alverne's story from John.
So Alverne, why don't you tell us a little bit what it was like working on Stacey's book?
Yeah. So it's weird because I was thinking about that as I was listening to all the other panelists, and I realized I wrote. It's probably the first time somebody's gonna be like, "Thank you, COVID," because I wrote the script while I had COVID. So I basically wrote the thing in a fevered pitch. So it was just one of those things where it just had so many pieces of research, and it just started. I don't know. By the grace of God, it started to come together. And before I knew it, it was just like, okay, wrote this thing, and I sent it off, and then I was like, okay, I'm going back into my coma for a while, and that's just kind of how it happened.
Well, and I mean, one thing I thought that I really loved about this book was the way the two of you came together, right? I mean, true disclosure, like I know Stacey very well. I know your work really well, and Alverne, like seeing the way you put this together, because one thing I think the history of Tulsa is difficult. It's difficult because it is a history of trauma. It is a story of utopia, but it's also the story of the fall of utopia. And it's a story of great loss. It's a story that we've seen actually. We saw it in Watchmen, right? And we saw it like literally map onto an origin for, a Superman type origin. We saw it in Lovecraft Country, right? We saw it again like a founding trauma for the character. So it's like it's laced in that way. And but at the same time, it's also, as a historical story, it's not a story that enough people are truly aware of. It has not been told in very many spaces, to the point where when you do the research, there's not even a lot of characters, right?
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in that element as well. Like how do you bring something to life when there's not like a biography out there of, there's not a whole bunch of biographies out there.
Right. For me, one of the biggest things when I thought about how this whole thing came together was, John always recalls that I sent them an email, and I think an hour later, Stacey called him, was like, "Hey, we got to do something on Greenwood." It was like, so it was like, you know, it was I guess by fate that this happened. But one of the things that I wanted to point out was that when we talk about those two examples of Lovecraft Country and we talk about Watchmen, one of the things I always, when I came to John and started talking about what I wanted to do and pitch the story, was that the first thing I said, I wanted to talk about the people. You know, everybody talks about the trauma of the massacre, but nobody talks about the utopia before it. You know, everything that was built up. And so I wanted to really expound on that and touch on that, because I felt like that was something that nobody knew about. Nobody, you know, everybody cares about the drama of the massacre, but nobody cares about the people that, you know, that came before the massacre. So for me, it was a lot of great research. There were some great books out there. There was a great documentary we found on YouTube. And then I just remember, for me, it was just going through a lot of small, like the Greenwood Historical Society was phenomenal, and some of the resources that they just had posted online. And so for me, being that I love history, I started going back and trying to find anything I could read. One of my great mentors, Mort Castle, always says that if you're going to write from a historical standpoint, the best way to learn how to write from them is to read things that were written at that time. So I started reading a lot of newspaper clippings, even if it wasn't about the massacre, just stuff that happened around that time, so I could try to get my mind wrapped around how we were going to approach the story. I remember Stacey going, at one point, he calls me up, he goes, "Yeah, I got the script, I'm about to start writing it." And he goes, "But I'm trying to find a way into it." And I was like, "Oh yeah, go get this." I think I had like a Pandora station or something that had like all this jazz music. And I was like, this is all I listened to, was like music from that time period, in order to get my mind into like what those people must have been listening to and experiencing at that time.
Really quickly, I do want to interject that as far as like origins of the project, I want to do a shout out to Charlie Kochman about, you know, his vision to kind of bring this to bear. We were actually having a conversation about, you know, then the new news around the George Floyd murder, and you know, and we were just kind of lamenting what was happening in the country. And so I saw that it was the anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and I sent him, you know, a picture of it, and he was like, "You know what? We should try to do something before. Can we do something before the centennial, which is actually coming up at the end of May?" And I thought it was impossible. I didn't know what we would do, but I was like, well, let's try to do something. And so, you know, a lot of it was just his, you know, back and forth with Charlie about how we could actually, like, as they say, crash the schedule to bring this book to bear. And I'm really glad that we did. And I'm very thankful for the diligence, because it really was a quick turnaround. This book is a miracle. It really shouldn't have, it shouldn't have been able to happen, because it was like, we had like, you know, author with COVID, we had like we actually had one of our writers for the essay actually was in a car accident. We actually had another one of the essay writers whose daughter had COVID. It was just really difficult to make, you know. So thank you so much for your diligence. And that's part of the story. I want to make sure that you understand that Charlie's input to get this, you know, to the publication board was invaluable. So.
Thank you, Charlie.
And yeah, that's also one of the things that was really interesting is are some of the creative decisions in this, right? Where you know, the decision not to fictionalize, the decision, you know what I mean, to not to create like a fictional character, to see this whole thing through, and to let it move in the way it did. In some ways, it felt like I really felt the timeline. I really felt, but at the same time, the way you built up the stakes by showing everything that was put in place before it was taken away. But I'd love to get some more thoughts on you guys from the two of you for in terms of that decision, because I know it opens it up to a different kind of audience as well.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things in doing the research that I found was just how Tulsa was built. It was like any town at that time. Everything was built on lumber and wood. But one of the things that fascinated me when I found out was that all of about 90% of the buildings in Greenwood were built of brick. They were made by hand, were made by the African Americans that lived in that community. And so that for me, when I found it out, that created this opposite of everything that was on the other side of the tracks. That idea that everything on the other side of the tracks had to be prominent, when in fact everything in Greenwood was the most prominent thing. Everything was built of brick, and then as you start going into the research, you start finding out about the circulation of the dollar. I think it was 26 times before it went outside of that community that dollar would stay within the community, and that was a lot because of Jim Crow. So for me, it was just finding all these small things that I thought I knew but didn't know, but then also expounding upon them to make sure that anybody, because my idea was that, or at least how I felt about it, was that this wasn't just African American history. This was American history. This was a part of American history that was lost. Kind of like when you talk about the Roanoke colony and that disappearance. This was the disappearance of a whole colony in a way, in part of a 19th century American history. I don't know about Stacey, but that's how I felt.
Interesting. I wanted to talk for a moment about the art style and that choice. The choice to illustrate I feel like the story in many places feels more like a children's book. It kind of lowers, I tried to lower the readership in a particular way, and or the audience for readership. And I chose that particular style because, and the very vibrant colors, was because, first of all, our past took place in color as well. And many times the theme of the weight and the theme of this particular story felt, it was, I wanted to show the joy in it, right? And I wanted parents and teachers to be able to converse this book. And there are some stylistic choices that I took the liberty, with it as well. I'm interested to see how the audience will view this, right? But I felt like I had to bridge like several areas at one time, right? I had to talk about the weight of the book. At the same time, I did not want this to be a trauma porn, right?
Mm-hmm.
Book. This is like the fourth book in a row that I worked on that was about Black death and trauma, and I was exhausted of that. So I tried to bring in joy and illustrate that into the story as much as possible, with the vibrancy of the colors as well. And I felt like the readership, in a particular way, this would allow for as a good entry point for those who are not familiar with the history, but also familiar with teachers who want to discuss this subject matter, but also with parents who want to discuss this with their children as well. There were some hard decisions that had to be made. I definitely, and I didn't agree with Alverne on a lot of the story choices he made. There's one particular part of the story, he had me blazing hot. And but at the same time, I believe it was historically accurate. Right. And so I wanted to give some hope to the audiences that would read this book, but at the same time tell our history. And of course the story was there, but as a visual storyteller, it is also my job to kind of tell the story that's under the story.
And that's really interesting, because I think that one of the things that I'll be honest, this is a difficult book for me, right? It's difficult because when I look back, I want to see the wonder, right? I want to see the joy. And even from the very beginning, you kind of know you're not going to get that. But I think that also, you know, the other thing that struck me was that this is also a Maroon story, right? You know, when we talk about slavery, when we talk about, you know, so much of what we talk about is the escape, right? And what's interesting about Greenwood is that it does the thing that the slave narrative doesn't do, that a lot of the Maroon stories do. The slave narrative ends with, oh, somebody has given you your freedom. Whereas what I find interesting about Maroon stories is that it involves African Americans taking their freedom and using their agency to create the next step, right? And that's what this is. It's we're creating the next step and watching the documentation of the creation of those next steps, right? And then to you know, and for that to become the stakes, right? Of, you know, as I said earlier, the stakes of, you know, in terms of what we lose at the very end, but then setting up and ending on rebuilding. I like that it didn't, and I like that it didn't end on, you know, everything's gone, let's be sad. But it's still a difficult, it's still a difficult book, right? You know, and in the contrast, you know, and also the visual contrast, right? You know, the brightness, you know, I did love that. Do you guys have any other thoughts you want to share before we go to Q&A?
Yeah, I guess it's one of those things when you like you say, when you think about it, it's a very difficult subject. But I imagine like you know, like when HBO made, like, imagine if this was Boardwalk Empire, but with all Black people. You know, that's what I envisioned when I sat down to write. I was like, what if this was our Boardwalk Empire and we got to tell that story? You know, and then that ending, the whole Christmas tree ending. There's a documentary that actually shows that Christmas tree and shows some of the descendants or the survivors of that time coming together, and you can see them in the background of that Christmas tree. You can see like the first building is being rebuilt at the same time that they're erecting this Christmas tree. And you're thinking, and for me, it became the symbolism of how Black people have always been. We're resilient, and that idea that out of the ashes we grow, or this tree in this town regrows out of the ashes of this terrible act.
Yeah, in closing, before we go to Q&A, I'll just say there was so much destroyed history that there was a lot that I had to imagine, right? And even with that, I'm very uncomfortable because I'm like, am I telling the truth, right? There were some figures that were in the story that I had no likenesses for, and I did as much digging as I possibly could. And I had to make up likenesses for them. I wasn't, or even some of the buildings, I wasn't very comfortable with making those decisions, but I will say that I did the best that I could with the information that I had. And like I said, I wanted to leave us with hope at the end of this, because we're about to absorb this on the centennial of this horrific event. And there's a lot to unpack. There's going to be a lot to unpack, but we have to proceed into the future with a level of joy.
Yes.
Amen. Well, let's try and let's see what we have as far as questions for the group. We got 3 great books. I'm waiting to see if any questions have been sent my way. Oh. So a lot of the questions are about that I'm seeing are really are about like how the, you know, about, you know, when the books are going to be available. Okay, there is one question. I'm sorry. I'm having trouble accessing the questions.
See one about target audience.
Yeah, okay. Can you read it? I'm sorry, I can't see the question.
It says, I asked a question about who the target audience is and whether the stories are expected to serve as parable. Yeah, and so, you know, my general statement is about like, you know, each book is kind of, it becomes its own thing. I guess we worry about like the marketing of the audience after the story is told to a certain degree. It wasn't at first that something like Across the Tracks would be a demographic for younger readers. It just ended up being the type of story that needed to be told in that way. After the Rain is definitely for more mature readers. I mean, it deals with a lot of, you know, body horror and like trauma in a particular way. It's a horror story. I think that when we're thinking about the overall curation of the books, that we're talking about not one particular experience, but a spectrum of experiences that kind of happen throughout the diaspora. And these are ways that we kind of deal with it. So I think what happens is like the book gets made and we start figuring out, you know, what the audience needs to be for it, you know. And I think each book itself is like just a piece of art. I mean, it's an artistic expression that lives within itself, and then we have to figure out, okay, well, who's gonna pick up these books? I don't think you should go into an enterprise like this and saying like, you know, this book is going to be for this audience, and then make it, you know. But yeah, but Eric can speak to Black Star, so.
Yeah, I always get a little sad when like a teacher with like elementary school kids is like, "Hey, is Black Star going to be okay for my kids to read?" It's so blunt and bloody. I don't think that's a great idea. But for young adults and adults, I'd say Black Star is right up everyone's alley. I mean, if they've heard a curse word, if they've seen violence on screen before, they'll be able to handle that book. And whether it's a parable, I had never thought of it in those terms before, but it's actually perfect. It's a really, really good way to describe what happens in the story. It has a very, very strict moral code, moral theme that is driving the whole thing the entire time. And again, you know, since I wrote this out of frustration, I think it ends appropriately, given who's right and who's wrong by the end of the story. So yeah, that's a great way to put it. Thank you for the parable suggestion. I may use that in the future to describe the book.
And we also have a question from Charlotte Sherman for Alverne, and the question is Charlotte's asking if you could talk more about the actual script writing. Had you written one before? Did you use a certain type of script writing software for this?
Oh, so yeah, I have written numerous comic books, graphic novels, some TV in South Africa. I've kind of written a little bit of everything. One of those writers that if I can see it, I can write it kind of thing. But yeah, how I script is that I use Final Draft, which is a script writing software. And how I go about when I script is that I number my panels, and then and usually I'll use if I can find a reference, I'll usually use references. And by references, I mean if there's something online I can find where I'm trying to get like a certain angle, or if in this case historical buildings or places, I would leave a note in there to the artist or to Stacey saying, "Hey, I found this thing. This is what it should look like." Especially if we're getting into like the newspapers and stuff that were of that time. I would try to find stuff like that. But yeah, I've written a whole bunch of things, I should say. Besides this, I write crime novels also. So yeah.
And along those lines, I actually have a question for John and David. How do you feel that adapting someone else's story? What is that like in contrast to writing your own story?
Well, I mean, I will say that you know, because of the work with Damien on the Octavia Butler books, that, you know, which in some ways are like trial by fire, because we're dealing with like, you know, just one of the most influential science fiction fantasy writers ever, you know. So that kind of like actually steeled me for the experience, because it's a lot of responsibility. In some ways, to me, as the adapter, like, you know, doing the script, because I did script and colors on this book, and you know, we actually were fortunate that we actually had Nettie to talk to. You know, Damien and I, we couldn't speak to Octavia Butler because she's passed on, but you know, Nettie was was actually really involved with the process. Like the things that we changed, we actually could run by her. You know, so that actually made it a lot easier transition. I think one thing to think about whenever you're doing adaptations is that if, you know, we're adapting this from a totally different medium, right? Doing this from prose to comics. And just that thought alone, you're already dealing with the fact that each medium has a different set of affordances, right? And so what we try to do, as always, is to try to like utilize what makes the comics medium different than prose, and actually rely on those differences to actually, you know, make it truly like the same story and the same affect, but through that medium. If that makes sense.
David, any thoughts?
Oh yeah. Like we're lucky to have started with to both have Nettie like available and start in a written medium. Like if we had, you know, adapting from one visual medium to another visual medium adds problems, you know, I think. But when you're since I'm doing I'm just doing the visual part of this, like I'm my only job in this is to try to capture what Nettie was trying to like, what she wanted essentially in the way that she was creating. So like I guess in the process of adapting, you know, my goal is really to please in a way the original creator, you know, to make sure that I'm capturing what they wanted. And then I think that kind of adds the level of authenticity to what the rest of the audience will get to experience, because they're not getting necessarily a watered down or an adapted version of an adaptation of an adaptation. You're getting the you know, the dubbed version of what something is. So that like John was saying, we have, you know, comics is its own medium, you know, prose is its own medium. So we're allowed to make some creative decisions. But overall, it's a collaborative process. So it does allow us to you know, have a discussion about what we want this adaptation to be, you know, like, and having those conversations is, I think, what makes it, or at least what, with After the Rain, is what makes it work really well. It's just the communication and the constant collaboration, and no desire for any one person to sort of shine and make it specifically about their artistic prowess, which is something I think when you're creating your own work, you're allowed to indulge and what you're creating. I mean, that is what artists do. We're self-indulgent people, you know. So we want to produce our idea, but with this, you know, it's fully collaborative. So it's about creating something that speaks to what Nettie was trying to develop, and what we as you know, visual creators wanted people to see.
Just to quickly piggyback off of what David's saying, I mean, I totally agree with all of that. In fact, it kind of like, you know, was in my head. I was like, yep. And I was going to say something very similar as far as like just the intentionality of the story, right? So, you know, David and I work on numerous projects, and, you know, I think David's a wonderful collaborator, because it's always about the story and about what is happening, you know, in the story, you know what I'm saying? And of course, you know, we're going to flex here and there, but for the most part, you know, even if we're doing our own stuff, it really is about what is necessary for the audience to get what's happening on the page. And David's an amazing visual storyteller as far as like just pacing and everything. It's an easy collaboration. I also want to say too, and this is something that I'm very proud of, is when Nettie had seen like the initial pages, particularly like the sequence on the road, she said basically that she couldn't have imagined like a better representation of what was in her head when she wrote the scene. And that is an amazing compliment, because she's a hard ass. Excuse me. Yeah. Nettie, Nettie Okorafor, Nnedi, Tim, Nettie Okorafor, the woman who wrote the original short story. I saw a question in the chat. Yeah. Dr. Nettie Okorafor. So.
And also, I mean, yeah, she's an amazing writer. I mean, she's written it all. She's written books. She's written comics as well. Yeah. Eisner Award winner. She's been awarded in both arenas. And I mean, we referred to it earlier, but she's also been been really thinking in terms of naming the genres of her work. In particular, she distinguishes her work as being African futurism and also African Jujuism, and which is distinct from Afrofuturism. And it's really, I mean, it's been, I was introduced to her by John many years ago, and it's just been a pleasure to see her work. John, I'd like because I think you could speak a little better. Could you explain what the difference between African futurism and Afrofuturism is?
Well, what I'll do is do a quick example from Nettie's description, right? So basically, we think about Black Panther as a kind of a hallmark in popular culture around Afrofuturism, right? So Nettie was like, well, Afrofuturism is T'Challa starts a center in Oakland at the end of the movie, right? Remember that? He actually starts the center so in African futurism, he starts that center in a neighboring country in Africa that doesn't have as much money. You see what I'm saying? So basically, the idea is that it's extremely centered on the continent, that it is not actually responding to westernized notions of speculation, that it's actually coming directly out of an African experience, in particular, like a West African experience in her particular case. But yeah, and so those are the main differences. Afrofuturism in its initial description is speaking to Black folk who are in America. I mean, that's in the original the original definition that Mark Derry gave us in '93. If you start to look at like different strains of it now, look at Dr. Ronaldo Anderson's Afrofuturism 2.0 definition, we start to see more about the diaspora. But Nettie's conjuring around like African futurism, African Jujuism are very specific to African concerns and have different tropes that are connected to that particular geographical and imaginative cultural space.
And what about African Jujuism?
Well, okay, so African Jujuism is dealing with, okay, so where is the speculation coming from, right? So if you think about futurism, we think about like science fiction in a particular way, think about how technology is being engaged with, right? But Juju is just it's a name for like the magical aspects of West African Nigerian culture, and so we're engaging with that. So if you think about speculation, is the idea of the speculative is coming from either like a really advanced technological space like science fiction, or it's coming from like a preternatural, unnatural, supernatural space like horror and fantasy and these types of things. So it's just her kind of parsing out the different ways that speculation is actually presenting itself through the narrative. What is the speculation coming from? Are you a cyborg or are you a witch? You know what I'm saying? That kind of thing, right? So that's kind of like what she's getting at. So yeah, and so many of these lines do blur though, that's right. But what I like about it too, and this is something I always think about fairly recently, we do get into a lot of these semantic arguments. I've seen them go down, they get real nasty, but I'm thinking about the Afrofuture as a destination, that we're all trying to get to a Black future together. you know, which is still like a radical notion these days, which actually brings us right back around to, you know, across the tracks narrative, right? So yeah, at the end of the day, you know, we're actually trying to, you know, we're trying to live and we're trying to tell these stories. We can argue, and as Stacey says a lot, you know, we should be arguing in a utopia. It's not perfect, right? And it gets real messy, you know, but I think we're also trying to use these narratives to fight about, you know, fight and talk about, you know, the past, the present, and the future simultaneously. So
Yeah, I think there's these lines between futurism and skepticism that are like married together right now. And I think there are Afro skeptics who are making work that fits within the narrative of, or it's being like co-joined to Afrofuturist ideas or to African Jujuism or something else. They're seen as this like this monolithic creative space, but they're actually much more nuanced. And we do need new. I mean, we have it in. We understand it in, let's say, musical context. We understand the difference between trap, you know, drum and bass, you know, lyrical, whatever, you know, like backpack rap. You can understand these differences. So the same kinds of structural and creative, I guess, creative, yeah, like differences need to be understood for Black creators as well. And what we're
yeah, I think so. And I think these different speculative notions give us you know, it's a spectrum of experiences, and it starts to chip away at the notion that we're a monolith. You know, definitely, I really agree with that. People, the first thing out their mouths is, "Well, explain Afrofuturism," you know, and it's different things, different people. It's more of a philosophical, you know, aesthetic. You know, there's different ways to come at it, just like anything. We're not simple, you know. Nothing about Black folk in the world is simple, you know, at all.
Well, and one thing I'd also like to sort of come back to, and it's in all of these books, is and it's very much aligned throughout all comics, right? Is the presence of violence and trauma, right? You know, even in the superhero genre, ultimately, a lot of stuff is being solved through a lot of things are being solved through violence, right? Violence has it's almost metaphorical, right? You know, and so as we talk about this idea of a Black Afro future, we're in a medium where violence is sort of the coin of the realm, and also trauma, and with dealing with African Americans, with Black life, trauma and violence, it's not funny. It's you know what I mean? It also has historical ties. So I'm really curious. I'd really like to hear all of you talk a little bit about what it's like to be illustrating violence and trauma. And I'd actually like to start with Arielle, if I can.
You know, it's interesting. I pretty much had to learn how to draw fighting for Black Star. I feel like it's actually typically not like a thing that I would just do casually in my life. But I think when I actually got to starting it, first of all, the way that Eric had laid it out in the script, he's a great fight choreographer, so it made my job like quite easy. But second of all, there was actually something very fun and cathartic about being able to draw people just beating the crap out of each other. I don't know, there was just like a fascinating way of like figuring out how to organize these like violent emotions in through the language of panels, and having that read. And I mean, I feel like perhaps Eric could speak more to the story, the structural aspects of why those violent scenes erupt. But I think I can say from an illustrator's point of view, it was like, yeah, it did feel very like I really felt like my inner feelings of like rage were being transferred over to my pen when I was doing it.
Well, thank you for doing that, Arielle. Yeah, again, it elevated everything. And yeah, I mean, the violence in Black Star isn't racialized at all. I've written some content with racial violence in it before, and I think I try to be a lot more careful and restrained about what I show. And in those cases, it's supposed to be like, almost like horror. You're supposed to just be appalled. In Black Star, these fights are a long time coming. I think you want these fights to happen because these women have a beef with each other that just it's separate from race. And in this case, it is so built up over time. The two of them have done such terrible things to each other that the only way to communicate is with this at a certain point. So Arielle did just a great job of just showing these two women who reach an emotional breaking point with each other and need to get home. They both feel that the other is not deserving, and that's all there is to it. So you could argue that maybe there's like some class dynamics between them while they're fighting, but it's a little bit separate from the kind of violence I've written before with more racially charged work.
And Alverne and Stacey.
I will go first. I'll go first. So in reference to drawing Black trauma, I mean, I think I touched on it before. This is like the fifth book. I want to say this is the fifth book I've worked on in a row that's been about Black trauma. And in it, what's odd about this is I keep getting these opportunities, and maybe it's because I do a good job. I don't know, right? But at the same time, I make it a point to find the joy in the book, because so imagine I'm doing two jobs, right? Or rather, I'm telling a story, I'm visualizing a story, and I'm telling that through my perspective of art making, right? While I'm doing this, I am also trying to survive in the story, meaning like I'm trying to not stress myself out. I'm trying to do a good job, and I'm trying to be sane at the end of all of this, right? Drawing Black trauma, and this is beyond, across the tracks. A lot of my work is about telling these horrific stories, but in a particular way, it makes me focus on my exhibition practice, which is about speculating these opulent, very beautiful, liberated Black futures at the same time, right? So one fuels the other in a particular way. And even in this, so for example, with Across the Tracks, I was able to, John and I were able to actually hire two former students, right? And my son, actually, who's in the other room, to help color the book. We had to knock this book out so quickly. I believe we had less than 2 months to knock this book out. And it took there was a lot of strain on it. There was a lot of sleepless nights, a lot of drinking coffee, going to bed, sleeping for an hour, 2 hours, getting back up and grinding for another 15 hours. That weighs on you in a particular way. But the drawing of Black trauma and trying to do the best job that I can possibly do, it also means that this is, for example, this is the first graphic novel on the Tulsa Race Massacre, right? And the rebuilding. You got one shot to get that right? And that's how I felt in carrying that. And then in a particular way, that when that weight is on you to get this right and to honor the legacy of those who suffered, and honor the descendants of those who survived, and then try to, you know, do a good job with that, but also try to leave a hope for the future in a way, which I'll keep coming back to. There's a lot of responsibility in that. And I feel like in a particular way, I've taken on the responsibility of telling our traumatic stories. You know, there's a lot more to talk about in reference to that. I think I will leave that there because I'm still trying to figure this out myself as I'm walking through it.
For me, that was one of the big critical, I guess, things. Normally I'm open to writing about any and everything, especially when it comes like action adventure type stuff. But when it came to Across the Tracks, that was I guess my big edit. It was that the first thing I said before we sat down and even talk about the book, I was like, I want to do any type of Black trauma. I was like, we had enough of that just living our everyday lives, you know? So for me, that was the biggest thing about this book, was that I made sure there would be no Black trauma. We would show the destruction, but as Stacey once said earlier, there would be no trauma porn to that idea of showing what this greatness meant in American history and to African Americans. I remember, I think it was me, John, and Stacey, we got on a call and we were talking, and it was just like, it just hit us at one point that how profound what we were doing was a part of history, but also like we were on the edifice of doing something that hadn't been done before, in the vein of talking about the story, and especially as a graphic novel. And I think at some point we all realized as we were talking, like we were all on the understanding that there would not one body shown in this book. And that was the thing that we came to. So for me, I guess I usually let a story dictate if there's supposed to be violence, but for this one, it was just, I had to make sure that the people that came before us lived in this graphic novel, in this narrative, in such a way that when readers go back and read it once, twice, they feel like, okay, I'm reliving this moment with these people, but I'm also living in a part of history where now I can go to that town. I can see where that church or that building was possibly erected before it got destroyed. And I can follow up and relive a part of history like we relive everything else in American history.
Another stylistic choice I also want to point out is there are a lot of, no spoiler alerts here, but there's a lot of gunshots in the book, right? But you won't see one muzzle flare. And unless and the reason I want to point that out is because you will probably miss it, right? But that was a stylistic choice in reference to kind of maybe lower the ability for readership as well. And once again, it's difficult when you're trying to tell this history in a particular way where children can absorb it as well as adults. And there are some choices that had to be made in that, and I think it was a good choice, but I wanted to point that out.
Well, we're running out of time. I've been asked to wrap this up. I want to thank you all for taking the time to talk with us. This has been an amazing panel. And for if everyone can get your faces on the screen so we can see you all as you say goodbye. For all of you who are out there and interested, these are all books coming out from Megascope under Abrams ComicArts. And again, we'll go down the list. We've got After the Rain by John Jennings and David Brame. We've got Black Star by Eric Glover and Arielle Jovellanos. And then we've got Across the Tracks by Alverne Bell and Stacey Robinson. So I hope that you all can, I hope that you all have a chance to check these works out. It's really amazing and fun. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.